What if your mind could make a decision before you even realized you were deciding? Imagine you're walking down a street when you suddenly hear a loud crash. You don't stop to calculate the probability of danger. You turn. Your heart reacts. Your attention locks onto the sound. The decision happened almost instantly. Now imagine a completely different situation. You're offered a new job. You need to compare the salary, commute, responsibilities, growth opportunities, stability, and dozens of other factors. Suddenly, thinking feels different. You slow down, you compare, you calculate, you question. Two very different kinds of thinking are happening inside the same mind. One is fast, automatic, emotional, and effortless. The other is slower, deliberate, analytical, and demanding. Daniel Kahneman spent decades studying these two modes of thought, and his discoveries reveal something fascinating. The mind that helps us make decisions quickly can also be the same mind that quietly leads us into predictable mistakes. Once you understand how these two systems work, you may start seeing your own decisions in a completely different way. We like to believe that we carefully think through our important decisions, but much of the time, we don't. Your brain is constantly making judgments. Is this person trustworthy? Is that sound dangerous? Does this price seem expensive? Is this idea familiar? Should I answer this message now? Most of these decisions happen without conscious effort, and that's necessary. Imagine having to consciously analyze every face you recognize, every word you read, every sound you hear, every movement you make. You would be mentally exhausted within minutes. So the brain uses shortcuts. It sees patterns, it makes assumptions, it fills gaps, it reaches conclusions quickly. This automatic process is incredibly useful, but there is a problem. The brain sometimes uses the same shortcuts in situations where they don't work very well. And because the answer arrives so quickly, we may never notice that an assumption was made. We simply experience the result as a feeling. This person seems trustworthy. This price seems reasonable. That explanation makes sense. The feeling arrives first. The reasoning often comes later. And that is where the story of fast and slow thinking really begins. Kahneman describes these two modes of thinking as System 1 and System 2. System 1 operates automatically. It is fast, it is intuitive, it requires little effort. When you recognize a familiar face, read a simple sentence, or notice that one object is larger than another, System 1 handles most of the work. System 2 is different. It is the part of your mind you use when you deliberately concentrate, when you calculate a difficult problem, compare complicated choices, learn something unfamiliar, or carefully examine an argument. System 2 has to step in. You can think of System 1 as the mind's automatic pilot, and System 2 as the mind's deliberate problem solver. But don't imagine two separate people living inside your head. These are ways of describing how your mind processes information. And most of the time, System 1 does the first pass. System 2 gets involved when the situation becomes difficult, or when something demands conscious attention. That arrangement is efficient, but it also creates a weakness. If System 1 produces an answer that feels convincing, System 2 may simply accept it without checking. Think about a simple question. What is 2 plus 2? The answer appears instantly. You don't need to concentrate. You don't need to calculate step by step. The answer simply arrives. Now, try something different. What is 17 multiplied by 24? Suddenly, the experience changes. You may know how to solve it, but you have to concentrate. You may write it down. You may calculate carefully. You feel the effort. That feeling is important. It tells you that your deliberate thinking system has become involved. System 2 requires mental energy, and because mental effort is limited, we don't want to use it unnecessarily. This is one reason the mind relies so heavily on intuition. If System 1 can produce an answer that seems good enough, System 2 often doesn't bother investigating further. That works beautifully in familiar situations. But when the environment is complicated, the shortcut can become a trap. The answer feels right, and because it feels right, we don't ask whether it is actually correct. Here's a simple example. Imagine you meet someone who speaks confidently, dresses professionally, and seems extremely comfortable in conversation. You immediately form an impression. This person is competent. But notice what happened. You didn't carefully evaluate their actual skills. You noticed a few visible signals, and your mind created a larger story. That is System 1 doing what it does best. It connects pieces of information quickly. The problem is that confidence doesn't necessarily mean competence. A polished appearance doesn't prove expertise. A person can speak beautifully and still know very little. Yet once your mind forms the first impression, System 2 may have to work hard to change it. This is one of the most important ideas in Kahneman's work. We don't simply think. We construct interpretations. And once an interpretation feels coherent, we tend to trust it. The mind prefers a simple story over an incomplete one. That preference makes the world easier to understand. But sometimes, the story is more confident than the evidence. This tendency becomes especially powerful when information is incomplete. Imagine hearing that someone is quiet, organized, and extremely detail-oriented. What kind of job do you imagine they have? Maybe you picture an accountant, maybe a librarian, maybe a researcher. Your mind immediately creates an image. But how much do you actually know? Very little. You have a few characteristics, and your brain fills in the rest. This is one of the remarkable abilities of System 1. It creates coherence from fragments. The problem is that coherence feels like truth. A story that fits together neatly can feel more convincing than a messy collection of facts. And this happens constantly. You see someone's behavior, then create an explanation. Someone doesn't reply to your message. You think they're ignoring you. A colleague looks serious in a meeting. You think they're unhappy with you. A friend cancels plans. You think they're losing interest. The mind hates uncertainty, so it creates a story. But sometimes, the story is simply a guess that feels like knowledge. This is where one of Kahneman's most important lessons appears. Your mind is designed to produce a coherent picture of the world, even when the information available to it is incomplete. That sounds harmless, but imagine making a major decision based on a story created from only a few facts. You meet someone once. You decide they're trustworthy. You hear one negative comment about a company. You decide the company is terrible. You experience one bad day at work. You decide you hate your entire career. One event becomes the explanation for everything. The brain prefers a simple narrative, but reality is often complicated. There may be information you don't know. There may be factors you cannot see. There may be alternative explanations. System 2 can help by asking, what else could explain this? But System 2 doesn't automatically challenge every assumption. It often accepts the first reasonable story. So one of the most useful habits you can develop is simple. When a conclusion arrives very quickly, ask yourself whether you actually have enough evidence. Now, let's talk about something that makes fast thinking even more interesting: attention. Your mind cannot focus deeply on everything. At any moment, countless things are happening around you. Sounds, movements, conversations, messages, thoughts, physical sensations. Yet you become consciously aware of only a small portion. Your attention selects what matters. And once attention is focused, everything outside that focus becomes easier to miss. Try this. Think about a time when you were deeply focused on a conversation. You may have completely forgotten what was happening around you. Someone could walk past, a phone could vibrate, a television could be playing, and you might barely notice. This is useful. Without selective attention, your mind would be overwhelmed. But it also means that what you don't notice can be just as important as what you do. When you're focused on one goal, you may overlook information that doesn't fit your attention. And this becomes especially dangerous when the missing information would change your decision. The mind isn't simply seeing reality. It is selecting a version of reality to process. Now let's talk about something that makes fast thinking even more interesting: attention. Your mind cannot focus deeply on everything. At any moment, countless things are happening around you. Sounds, movements, conversations, messages, thoughts, physical sensations. Yet you become consciously aware of only a small portion. Your attention selects what matters. And once attention is focused, everything outside that focus becomes easier to miss. Try this. Think about a time when you were deeply focused on a conversation. You may have completely forgotten what was happening around you. Someone could walk past, a phone could vibrate, a television could be playing, and you might barely notice. This is useful. Without selective attention, your mind would be overwhelmed. But it also means that what you don't notice can be just as important as what you do. When you're focused on one goal, you may overlook information that doesn't fit your attention. And this becomes especially dangerous when the missing information would change your decision. The mind isn't simply seeing reality, it is selecting a version of reality to process. This helps explain why multitasking often feels easier than it actually is. You may think you're answering messages while listening to a meeting, or checking email while working on an important project. But attention has limits. When tasks compete for the same mental resources, performance can suffer. The problem is that you may not immediately feel the decline. You feel busy, you feel productive, you feel like you're doing several things at once. But feeling productive and producing good work are not always the same thing. System 2 is especially sensitive to mental load. The more difficult the task, the more attention it requires. And when attention is divided, errors become easier. This is why some of your best decisions happen when you create space to think. Turn off the notifications. Remove unnecessary distractions. Give the problem your full attention. It sounds simple, but in a world designed to constantly interrupt you, focused thinking has become a valuable skill. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is give your mind fewer things to process. Now consider how quickly your mind can be influenced by a number. Imagine I ask you, is the tallest tree in the world more than 100 feet tall? You might say yes. Now I ask, how tall do you think it is? Your estimate may be influenced by that first number. But what if I had asked whether the tree was more than 1,000 feet tall? Your estimate could change. This is related to a powerful psychological effect called anchoring. The first number you encounter can influence the judgment that follows. The strange part is that the number doesn't have to be relevant. A price tag can influence what you think something is worth. A salary mentioned during negotiation can influence the rest of the discussion. A suggested target can influence your expectations. The anchor becomes a starting point, even when it shouldn't. And once an anchor enters your mind, your judgment often adjusts around it. The adjustment may not be enough. So the first number isn't just information. Sometimes it becomes the frame through which you interpret everything that comes afterward. Imagine you're negotiating the price of a car. The seller says, "These usually go for 10 lakh rupees." Even if you haven't researched the market yet, that number enters your mind. Now a price of 9 lakh may feel like a good deal. But what if the actual market value is 7 lakh? The anchor changed your perception. This is why the first number in a negotiation can matter so much. It can influence the range you consider reasonable. The same thing happens with salaries. Someone says, "People in this role usually earn this much." Now that figure becomes psychologically important. You may negotiate around it, even if the true range is different. The lesson isn't to ignore every number. Numbers are useful. The lesson is to ask whether the number deserves to influence your judgment. Before accepting an anchor, look for independent information. What does the market say? What does the evidence say? What would you have thought before hearing the number? Sometimes the best defense against an anchor is simply recognizing that an anchor has been placed. Another powerful shortcut is what Kahneman calls availability. When something comes easily to mind, we often assume it is common, important, or likely. Imagine you watch several news reports about airplane accidents. Suddenly, flying may feel more dangerous, not because the actual probability changed, but because examples of accidents are now easier to remember. The mind uses memory as evidence. If examples come quickly, the event feels more likely. This can happen with almost anything. You hear several stories about scams, and suddenly you become convinced that everyone is trying to deceive you. You hear about a few successful entrepreneurs, and success may begin to look easier than it really is. You see repeated stories about crime, and the world can feel more dangerous. The problem is that memorable events are not necessarily common events. A dramatic story is easier to remember than an ordinary one, but reality is usually filled with ordinary events. So when something feels extremely likely simply because examples come quickly, pause. Ask, am I estimating probability, or am I remembering vivid stories? This is one reason headlines can have such a powerful effect on us. A rare event can receive enormous attention. We see it repeatedly, our minds store the images, we talk about it, we remember it, and soon the event feels common. Meanwhile, millions of ordinary events happen without anyone reporting them. Nothing dramatic happened, so they disappear from memory. This creates a strange imbalance. The world may be statistically ordinary, while your memory makes it feel extraordinary. This matters in everyday decisions. You might avoid something because you've recently heard about a bad outcome. You might overestimate a risk because it is emotionally vivid. You might underestimate a slow, invisible risk because it doesn't produce dramatic stories. The mind asks, can I easily imagine this happening? And sometimes it mistakes the answer for how likely is this. Those are not the same question. A vivid possibility can still be extremely unlikely, and a boring possibility can still be extremely important. Another major idea in Kahneman's work is loss aversion. We don't experience gains and losses equally. Losing something often feels more painful than gaining the same thing feels pleasurable. Imagine finding 1,000 rupees. You would probably feel happy. Now imagine losing 1,000 rupees that you already had. The emotional reaction may be much stronger. The amount is identical. The psychological experience is not. This helps explain why people sometimes make strange financial decisions. They hold on to a losing investment because selling would make the loss feel real. They avoid a reasonable opportunity because they fear losing money. They reject a gamble with a potentially good outcome because the possibility of loss feels too painful. The mind is not simply asking, what is the expected value? It is asking, how will this feel if I lose? That emotional question can dominate the calculation. And once you understand loss aversion, you begin to see why fear of losing can be more powerful than the desire to gain. Think about a person who refuses to sell something they no longer need. Maybe it's an old investment. Maybe it's a product they bought but never use. Maybe it's something sitting in a cupboard for years. They say, I paid a lot for this, but the money is already gone. The question should be, what is this worth to me now? Yet ownership changes perception. Once something belongs to us, we often value it more. This is related to the endowment effect. Ownership creates attachment. A simple object can feel more valuable simply because it is ours. This happens with physical possessions, but it can also happen with ideas. A belief you've held for 20 years can become emotionally valuable. Questioning it can feel like losing part of yourself. A strategy you created at work can feel difficult to abandon. A decision you made years ago can become part of your identity. The longer something feels like mine, the harder it can become to evaluate it objectively. Now let's talk about one of the most dangerous illusions in decision-making: overconfidence. We often feel more certain than the evidence justifies. You make a prediction, you feel confident, then reality surprises you. This happens in business, investing, relationships, career decisions, even ordinary daily life. The problem is that confidence feels like information. If you feel 90% certain, it is tempting to believe the probability must be around 90%. But confidence and accuracy are different things. Someone can be extremely confident and completely wrong. In fact, after an event happens, the mind often creates a story that makes the outcome seem obvious. You might think, I knew this was going to happen. But did you? Or does the result simply make the past feel more predictable than it actually was? This is connected to hindsight bias. Once we know the outcome seems easier to explain. And that can make us overconfident about our ability to predict the future. The future is uncertain, but the mind doesn't like uncertainty. So afterward, it creates a story in which everything makes sense.
Imagine a business launches a new product. Before launch, the executives are uncertain. They debate, they make forecasts, they discuss risks. Then the product succeeds. Afterward, everyone says, "We knew customers would love it." But perhaps they didn't. The successful outcome simply made the original uncertainty disappear from memory. This matters because organizations can learn the wrong lesson from success. They may believe the strategy was brilliant when luck played a major role. Then they repeat the strategy, and when conditions change, the same approach fails. Success does not always prove that the decision was good. Failure does not always prove that the decision was bad. A decision should be evaluated based on the information available when it was made, not only by what happened afterward. That is difficult because outcomes are emotionally powerful. But separating decision quality from outcome quality is one of the most important skills in rational thinking. Sometimes a good decision produces a bad result. Sometimes a bad decision gets lucky.
Another fascinating idea is the planning fallacy. People regularly underestimate how long complicated tasks will take. You start a project and think, it'll be finished by Friday. Friday arrives, you're nowhere near finished. So you tell yourself, just a few more days. Why does this happen? Because when we plan, we focus on the task itself. We imagine the ideal path. We don't automatically include every interruption, every mistake, every delay, every unexpected problem. We create a clean story. But real life is messy. Projects contain surprises. People get sick. Technology fails. Approvals take longer. Other priorities appear. And yet, we continue making plans as if everything will go smoothly. One way to improve planning is to look outward. Instead of asking, how long do I think this will take? Ask, how long have similar projects actually taken? Historical evidence can be uncomfortable, but it is often more reliable than intuition. Your imagination sees the plan. Reality remembers the pattern. This is where another important distinction appears: the inside view and the outside view. The inside view looks at your specific situation. You think about your project, your team, your resources, your motivation. Everything seems unique. The outside view asks a different question. What usually happens to projects like this? That question may feel less personal, but it can be more accurate. Imagine you're planning to write a book. The inside view says, I have a great idea. I'll be disciplined. I can finish quickly. The outside view says, how long do similar books usually take to complete? The second question introduces reality into the prediction. This doesn't mean your project will follow the average exactly. It means you're no longer pretending that your situation exists outside history. Whenever you're making an important prediction, look for comparable cases. Your intuition can tell you what feels possible. The outside view can tell you what tends to happen. And when the two disagree, pay attention. Kahneman also explores how we evaluate experiences. And here, the mind behaves in a surprisingly strange way. Imagine a holiday that lasts 10 days. Most of it is wonderful. Then the final day goes badly. When you remember the trip later, that final experience can influence your overall memory far more than you would expect. This relates to what is sometimes called the peak end rule.
We don't remember an experience by calculating every moment equally. We tend to give special weight to the most intense moment and the ending. That means the way an experience ends can change how we remember the entire experience. A restaurant can serve an excellent meal, but if the final interaction is unpleasant, your memory of the evening may become negative. A vacation can be wonderful, but a terrible ending can dominate the story you tell later. This doesn't mean the earlier moments disappear. It means memory is not a perfect recording. It is a reconstruction. And understanding that can change how you think about your own past.
There is a deeper idea hidden here. The person who experiences an event and the person who later remembers that event are not exactly the same. Kahneman distinguishes between the experiencing self and the remembering self. The experiencing self lives through each moment. The remembering self creates the story afterward. And those two selves can want different things. Imagine spending 2 hours waiting in a long line. The experience is frustrating, but later you remember the event as part of a funny story. Or imagine a difficult trip that contains one extraordinary moment. The experience may have been exhausting, but the memory becomes meaningful. The remembering self asks, what was the experience like? It doesn't necessarily calculate every moment. This matters when making life decisions. We sometimes choose experiences based on how we imagine we will remember them, rather than how we will actually experience them. A person may choose an expensive holiday because it will create impressive memories, while ignoring the stress of getting there. So when making an important choice, ask yourself 2 questions. How will I experience this? And how will I remember it?
Another major idea is framing. The way a problem is presented can change the decision people make, even when the underlying facts are identical. Imagine a medical treatment described as having a 90% survival rate. That sounds reassuring. Now describe the same treatment as having a 10% mortality rate. Suddenly, it feels more frightening. The numbers haven't changed, the frame has. This is one reason language matters so much. A salary can be described as a monthly amount or an annual amount. A discount can be described as money saved or money spent. A decision can be framed as gaining something or avoiding a loss. The mind reacts differently to the different descriptions. This doesn't mean every frame is deceptive. Sometimes framing simply makes information easier to understand. But when a decision matters, try changing the frame yourself. Ask, how would this look if I described it the opposite way? If your opinion changes dramatically, you've learned something important. This becomes especially important in negotiations. Imagine someone says, you're getting a discount of 2 lakh rupees. Your mind focuses on the savings. But another way to frame the same situation is, you're still paying 8 lakh rupees. The first frame highlights the gain. The second highlights the cost. Both statements can be true, but they produce different feelings. This is why smart decision-making sometimes requires deliberately changing the question. Instead of, how much am I saving? Ask, how much am I actually spending? Instead of, how much could I gain? Ask, what could I lose? Instead of, why should I do this? Ask, why shouldn't I? The goal isn't to become negative. It's to see the decision from multiple angles. System 1 naturally accepts the first frame it receives. System 2 can step back and create another. That small change in perspective can reveal information that was invisible before. Now consider a different problem. You are asked a difficult question. Instead of solving it directly, your mind may quietly substitute an easier question. Suppose someone asks, how satisfied are you with your life? That's complicated. Your mind might unconsciously ask, am I happy today? Or how did my week go? The easier question produces an answer, and the mind treats it as if it answered the original. This is called attribute substitution. It is one reason our judgments can be surprisingly inconsistent. A difficult question arrives, the brain looks for something easier. Then it gives you an answer quickly. You don't feel like you avoided the real question. You feel like you answered it. This happens constantly. Is this person a good leader? Becomes, do I like this person? Is this investment safe? Becomes, does the company seem successful? Is this career right for me? Becomes, does this job sound impressive? The easier question can be useful, but it isn't necessarily the right question.
This is why one of the most powerful habits in thinking is asking, what question am I actually answering? Imagine you're deciding whether to accept a job. You might focus on salary, because salary is easy to compare. But the real question is much larger. Will this job improve my life? Will I learn? Will I grow? Will the environment suit me? Will the commute drain me? Will the role move me toward the future I want? Salary is measurable. Meaning is harder. So the brain may substitute the difficult question with the easy one. And suddenly, the highest number wins. The same thing happens with relationships. Is this person right for me? Can become, do they find me attractive? Or do other people like them? Again, the easier question is not necessarily the right one. The ability to identify the real question and resist the easier substitute is a powerful form of intellectual discipline. Sometimes thinking better doesn't require more information. It requires asking a better question.
Another important lesson from Kahneman is that intuition isn't always bad. In fact, intuition can be remarkably powerful under the right conditions. An experienced professional can sometimes recognize a pattern almost instantly. A skilled doctor may notice something unusual. A firefighter may sense danger. A chess player may recognize a familiar position. An experienced negotiator may notice that something feels wrong. This kind of intuition can be valuable, but it depends on two conditions. The environment must contain meaningful patterns, and the person must have enough experience to learn those patterns. In a predictable environment, intuition can become highly skilled. In a chaotic environment, confidence can be misleading. That's an important distinction. A person may have 20 years of experience, but if the environment doesn't provide reliable feedback, those years don't necessarily create accurate intuition. Experience alone isn't enough. Experience plus useful feedback is what allows intuition to improve. So when someone says, I have a feeling, don't automatically dismiss it, but don't automatically trust it either. Ask, is this a situation where intuition has actually had a chance to learn?
This explains why some experts are remarkably accurate, while others are confidently wrong. A professional who repeatedly receives clear feedback can learn from mistakes, but a person making predictions about complex systems may receive little useful feedback. They make a prediction, months later, reality changes, the reasons are unclear. They can easily explain the outcome afterward, and without clear feedback, their confidence can grow faster than their accuracy. This is one reason humility matters. Being experienced doesn't guarantee being right. Sometimes the smartest expert is the one who knows where their intuition is reliable and where it isn't. You can develop the same awareness in your own life. Think about the areas where your instincts have repeatedly been accurate. Maybe you understand people well. Maybe you're good at recognizing quality. Maybe you have strong judgment in your profession. Now think about areas where your predictions repeatedly fail. Money, relationships, time estimates, future trends. Knowing the difference is valuable. Good judgment isn't trusting intuition everywhere. It is knowing when intuition deserves your trust.
And then there is one of the most important ideas of all, cognitive ease. When something feels easy to understand, familiar, clear, or pleasant, we are more likely to accept it. A statement you've heard many times can feel more believable simply because it is familiar. A clean design can make a product feel more trustworthy. A simple explanation can feel more convincing than a complicated one. A name that is easy to pronounce can feel more comfortable. The mind likes fluency. When processing information feels easy, System 1 experiences that ease as a positive signal. But ease doesn't equal truth. Something can be familiar because you've heard it repeatedly, not because it is accurate. A simple explanation can feel satisfying, while a more complicated explanation may actually be closer to reality. This is why repetition is powerful. The more often you encounter an idea, the less mentally difficult it becomes. Eventually, familiarity itself can begin to feel like truth. So, when something feels unusually convincing, ask yourself, do I believe this because it is well supported, or because it is easy to process?
Now let's connect all these ideas. Fast thinking is incredibly useful. It allows you to move through the world without analyzing everything. But it also produces predictable biases. Anchoring can distort your estimates. Availability can distort your sense of probability. Loss aversion can distort your choices. Overconfidence can distort your predictions. Framing can distort your interpretation. Cognitive ease can make familiarity feel like truth. And the most surprising part is, you don't have to be careless for these effects to occur. They happen because of the architecture of normal human thinking. That's why intelligence alone doesn't protect you. A very intelligent person can still be influenced by an anchor. A highly educated person can still fall for a vivid story. An experienced professional can still become overconfident. The problem isn't that we don't know enough. Sometimes the problem is that our minds are operating.
So, what can you actually do with all of this? First, slow down when the decision matters. You don't need to use System 2 for every small choice. That would be exhausting. But when money, career, relationships, or major commitments are involved, give yourself time. Second, look for the first number. What was the anchor? What price did you see first? What salary did you hear first? What target was suggested? Third, look for vivid examples. Are you estimating probability or remembering a dramatic story? Fourth, challenge your confidence. How certain are you? What evidence would prove you wrong? Fifth, use the outside view. What usually happens in similar situations? And finally, change the frame. Ask how the same decision looks from another perspective. These aren't complicated techniques, but they create something valuable: friction. They make automatic thinking slow down long enough for deliberate thinking to become involved.
The goal isn't to become a person who thinks slowly all the time. That would be impossible. Imagine calculating every decision before you cross a road, or carefully analyzing every conversation, or consciously working out how to recognize every familiar object. Life would become exhausting. Fast thinking is one of the greatest abilities of the human mind. The real skill is knowing when to let it run and when to ask it to step aside. When the stakes are low, trust your instincts. When the stakes are high, check them. When the situation is familiar, intuition may be useful. When the situation is unfamiliar or unpredictable, be more cautious. When you feel extremely confident, look for reasons you might be wrong. When something feels obvious, ask whether the evidence is actually strong. The goal isn't perfect rationality, it is better judgment. And better judgment often begins with one simple habit: knowing that your first answer may not be your final answer.
Perhaps the most humbling lesson in thinking fast and slow is that we are often unaware of the processes shaping our own decisions. We experience thoughts as if they simply appeared. We feel an impression. We feel an emotion. We feel certain. And then we create an explanation. But the mind has been working underneath the surface. It has noticed patterns, retrieved memories, made comparisons, created associations, filled gaps, generated a conclusion. By the time the conclusion reaches consciousness, much of the work has already happened. This doesn't mean your conscious mind is powerless. It means you should respect the complexity of the machinery producing your thoughts. Your mind is incredibly capable. It is also imperfect. And perhaps wisdom begins when you can hold both truths at once. You can trust yourself without assuming you're always right. You can value intuition without treating it as proof. You can be confident while remaining open to correction.
That combination is rare and incredibly powerful.
Think about the last important decision you made. What influenced it? Was there a number that became your reference point? Was there a memorable story? Did fear of loss play a role? Did you become more confident after finding one piece of supporting evidence? Did someone frame the decision in a particular way? Did familiarity make one option feel safer? Did you compare the situation with similar cases? Or did you simply choose the option that felt right? There is nothing wrong with feeling. The question is whether the feeling deserves to control the decision. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. The ability to tell the difference is what matters. And you won't always get it right. Nobody does. But even recognizing the possibility of bias can improve your decisions. Because once you know your mind has shortcuts, you can start looking for them. And when you look for them, you create opportunities to think more carefully.
There is also something deeply human about all of this. Our minds are not designed to give us perfect answers. They're designed to help us survive, act, decide, and move forward. Speed has enormous value. If you had to analyze every possibility before reacting to danger, you wouldn't survive very long. So the brain developed shortcuts, and those shortcuts remain active even when the environment changes. The same system that helped us react quickly to danger can now react quickly to an email. The same tendency that helped us learn from social groups can now make us vulnerable to online popularity. The same fear of loss that once protected valuable resources can now make us irrational about money. Human psychology didn't suddenly become flawed. Our environment became more complicated. And that makes understanding our own minds more important than ever. We don't need to fight our instincts. We need to understand when they are helping and when they are leading us somewhere we didn't consciously choose. Maybe the most useful question to carry forward is this. Is this my considered judgment or simply my first impression? That question creates a pause, and inside that pause, you can investigate. You can look for evidence. You can challenge the anchor. You can consider another explanation. You can estimate the probability more carefully. You can ask what happened in similar situations. You can change the frame. You can consider what you might be missing. Sometimes your original intuition will survive the examination, and that's perfectly fine. The point isn't to disagree with yourself for the sake of being rational. The point is to know why you believe what you believe. Because sometimes, after slowing down, you discover that your first instinct was right. Other times, you discover something much more valuable. You discover that your first instinct was simply a story your mind created before it had enough information.
And perhaps that is what makes this book so powerful. It doesn't tell you that your mind is broken. It shows you how remarkable it is and how predictable its mistakes can be. Your brain can recognize patterns instantly. It can understand language. It can read emotions. It can make rapid decisions. It can learn from experience. But it can also jump to conclusions. It can mistake familiarity for truth. It can overestimate rare events. It can fear losses more than it values gains. It can become anchored by arbitrary numbers. It can construct stories from incomplete evidence. Knowing this doesn't make you weaker. It makes you more prepared. Because the goal of understanding psychology isn't to become perfectly rational. It is to become more aware of the moments when your mind is most likely to fool you. And when you recognize those moments, you can slow down. You can question. You can reconsider. You can choose. So the next time you feel certain, pause. The next time a number immediately feels reasonable, pause. The next time a dramatic story changes your perception of risk, pause. The next time a decision seems obvious, pause. Not because your mind is always wrong, but because your mind is incredibly fast. And sometimes speed hides assumptions. You don't have to distrust yourself. You simply need to give yourself permission to check. That small habit can improve decisions about money, relationships, career, health, business, and the future.
because every decision is built from assumptions, and some assumptions are invisible until you deliberately look for them. Thinking better isn't about thinking constantly. It's about knowing when thinking more carefully is worth the effort.
In the end, thinking fast and slow leaves us with a humbling idea. The mind that helps us navigate the world can also quietly distort the world we think we're seeing. System 1 gives us speed. System 2 gives us deliberate thought. We need both. The goal isn't to silence intuition. It is to recognize when intuition needs a second opinion. When the stakes are high, slow down. When emotions are intense, slow down. When a number becomes an anchor, step back. When a story feels especially convincing, look for the missing information. When you're certain, ask what could make you wrong. And when something simply feels obvious, remember that obviousness is a feeling, not proof. Your mind will always take shortcuts. That's part of being human. But awareness gives you the ability to notice those shortcuts, and sometimes choose a better path. Perhaps the most important lesson isn't to think more, it's to think better. Know when to trust your instincts, know when to question them, know when a decision deserves more attention, and know when your mind may be giving you an answer simply because it is easy. You don't have to become perfectly rational. You only have to become a little more aware, a little more curious, and a little more willing to question your first reaction. Because your first thought is not always your best thought. Your strongest feeling is not always the truth. And your confidence is not always evidence. Sometimes the smartest decision begins with a pause. If this book changed the way you understand your own mind, don't let the ideas disappear when this video ends. Think about one decision you're making right now and ask yourself, am I thinking carefully or am I simply reacting? If you enjoyed this summary, like the video and subscribe for more psychology, human behavior, self-improvement, and powerful book summaries.